Welcome to the case of the lady who owned no shoes, a chilling Sherlock Holmes mystery of secrets, charity, and betrayal. Prepare to walk barefoot through London's fog of deception. Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. It was on a wet November morning, when the fog came down Fleet Street in sluggish folds and the pavements shone like dull jet, that a peculiar disturbance was observed in Belgrave Square. At 7:15, Constable Merrick, making his round along the east side railings, noticed first the unnatural silence of the birds in the drawing-room aviary of number 22. And then, a moment later, the extraordinary fact that an open cab had been left askew across the mews, its horse still steaming and its driver nowhere in view. The cab's lamps guttered in the mist. One flared and died and was not relit. A maid ran out upon the steps, bareheaded and white-faced, and called down the railings for the constable. What she said at first was scarcely intelligible, for her words tumbled over one another in that piercing treble which servants use in the extremity of fear. But from the broken phrases and the urgent gestures, the constable gathered that something was dreadfully amiss with her mistress, Lady Imogen Ashdown, philanthropist, eccentric of a well-known family, and, in society's mild scandal, the lady who owned no shoes. The door admitted him to a hall, smelt strongly of carbolic and damp wool. It was curiously bare of umbrellas, and the low shoe press by the umbrella stand gaped empty. The maid Eunice took him at once up a shallow flight of stairs to a morning room that gave upon a covered conservatory. It was a handsome apartment with pale paneling, a pianoforte, and a Turkish rug that lay not flat but canted, as though some careful hand had rolled a corner beneath itself. Upon a chaise longue, near a low table set for tea, Lady Imogen reclined with her eyes closed and her hands folded. At first glance, she might have been only asleep after a charitable late sitting. At second, the constable noted the odd pallor, the faint bluish cast about the lips, and the unnatural stillness which no sleeping person ever maintains. The windows were bolted from within. The hearth fire, laid but unlit, showed a single match burned down into a small, ragged nub upon the iron grate. A faint odor, not of gas and not precisely of perfume, was in the room, something sharp and dry, which set the back of the tongue tingling, and faded when one tried to catch it. On the tea-table sat a cup with a thin ring of milk about the rim, a plate with half a slice of bread and butter left unbitten, and a small earthenware bowl in which a sponge lay sodden in warm, now lukewarm water. Went in to light her fire, as every day, sir, Eunice chattered, and found her so, as quiet as the lamb. Only what? Said Merrick. Only the shoes, sir, the maid whispered, with a glance of fright into the corners of the room, as though shoes might spring out at her from the wainscoting. All the shoes is gone. Merrick looked down involuntarily at his own boots, greased to a soldierly shine. What do you mean all? The whole house, Eunice breathed. Her ladyship never wore them. Never owned a pair in her life, sir, by vow as a girl. For the suffering poor. But ours, mine and cook's and butler's and his lordship's when he comes down, every last shoe in the press is gone, and the charwoman's clogs too. The front press, the back press, the guest closet stripped bare, sir, and last night there were dozens. Merrick, who had never been invited to consider a world bereft of boots, felt the back of his neck prickle. He crossed to the conservatory door. It was locked, the key inside, and the glass above beaded with damp. Through it he could see the faint silhouettes of palms and a little iron table upon which lay a gardener's catalogue, splotched with soil. He rattled each window latch. He examined the bell-pull, which hung slightly skew to the right. On the parquet beneath the pianoforte lay a scatter of fine, pale grit that did not match the city's common soot. It clung to the edges of the casters and made a faint crescent beneath the right pedal, as though some foot had pressed and released it many times with an unmusical patience. Who else is in the house? He asked. Only me and cook. The butler's gone since my Calmus retired, they say. His lordship is at Cowes. The charwoman comes at 6. and she's not come this morning, nor yesterday neither, though she sent a boy with a note for her wages. Any callers last night? Only Mr. Copeland from Jude's mission, sir, to fetch the parcels. He comes Thursdays. And Mr. Melrose, her ladyship's cousin, to ask after the subscriptions. Which left first? Mr. Copeland. He left in the fog a little after 9. Mr. Melrose stayed and had coffee with her. Ladyship, I heard the pianoforte at 10:30, and then all went quiet. Merrick stooped to the rug. He was a careful man, slow to cry miracle when mischief would do, and he knew a scuffle's signature. But the nap lay smooth save for that rolled corner. He set his finger on the heap. It did not spring back, but held, as if something had weighted it. He lifted the corner, and there, pressed into the indent, where the corner had been, lay a tiny, triangular scrap of stiff blue paper, no larger than a fingernail, with a punched hole near one edge, the kind of fragment which might break from a ticket when a string is yanked through it. Upon it, in minute print, ran a fragment of a word: monger, fishmonger, costermonger, or something more professional, showmonger, if such a term existed. Merrick pocketed it. At 7:07, the doctor, a thin man with an apologetic moustache, arrived and made the pronouncement which fear had already drafted. Lady Imogen Ashdown was dead, and had been so, in his opinion, for some hours. He found no mark of violence save a faint row of pinprick cuts upon the soles, if the word might be used of her bare feet, as though she had walked recently upon something granular and sharp. He shook his head at the windows, sniffed the air once, and shrugged. A failure of the heart, perhaps. The poor lady exposed herself constantly to inclement weather without footwear. The system, you know. Rebels. Rebels? Merrick muttered, though he did not contradict. A heart will rebel, no doubt, but it rarely subtracts every boot from the premises in the same hour. By 8 o'clock, the square wagons of Scotland Yard were in the mews, and Inspector Lestrade himself stood scowling into the morning room. He was a brisk little man with a keen professional impatience for dramatic trifles. He examined the bolts, tested the chimney-piece, and held his palm in front of the keyhole as if to feel for drafts of guilt. "Locked room," he said at last, without admiration. "Most tiresome form of mischief, always either suicide or a trick with the windows, and yet she shows no sign of either. No bruise, no cord. You say every shoe's gone?" "Every last pair, sir," said Eunice, who had regained something of her voice and was now anxious to be useful. Lestrade made a note with his small, stinging pencil. "When a house has no shoes," he observed, "its feet may still walk. Merrick, send a man to the charwoman's lodgings. Fetch Mr. Copeland of Jude's and Mr. Melrose of the family, and anyone who makes free with Lady Ashdown's hospitality, and ask the cabman outside why he's left his horse cooling its heels." They found the cabman, eventually, not outside but in the kitchen, warming his hands over a kettle. He was a bony fellow from Hammersmith, who explained that he had been sent round, close upon midnight, by a gentleman to fetch a parcel from the tradesman's entrance. "Parcel weren't ready," he said, "and then the gentleman didn't come out, and I got the shivers in the fog, and the kitchen maid, that's her, told me to wait inside." He could not describe the gentleman beyond. Quiet voice. Wore gloves. Walked as if he knew where the floor is. "What did he call himself?" Lestrade snapped. The cabman scratched his ear. "Didn't say a name, sir. Only asked if I'd take a parcel to Shoreditch. Told him I would, if it were honest weight and no tricks with the fare." "And the parcel?" "Never came, sir. But the gentleman did say, leastwise I think I heard 2 and 10 for the dozen to the kitchen maid, which I took to be eggs, though eggs is dear." 2 and 10 for the dozen," Lestrade repeated, and glanced toward the empty shoe-press that gaped like a toothless mouth. The doctor, growing fidgety, asked that the body be moved, for the damp in the conservatory was not kind to a lady even in death. Lestrade assented. The maid fetched shawls to lay over the chaise. In the shifting of rugs and the careful lifting of cushions, another small curiosity came to light. Beneath the corner of the Turkish rug opposite the rolled one, there lay a faint, perfect circle of reddish stain upon the floorboards, no larger than a sixpence. It was as though some small ring of iron had rested there for a time and then been removed, leaving its thin rust halo behind. Near it, in the crack between board and skirting, the constable's knife teased out a single grey thread, barely half an inch long, and of a twist quite unlike the carpet's pile, too fine for wool, too coarse for silk. "Nothing but household trifles," Lestrade declared, though he pocketed both the circle's memory and the thread. "The real mischief is in motives. Money? There's none to be had. She gave it all away. Enemies? Only those who dislike good works. A lover? She was as cold to lovers as she was to shoe leather. We shall find we are dealing with a failure of the heart, assisted, perhaps, by the chill of charity." "And the shoes?" Merrick ventured. "The shoes will come home when they have finished their walk." Lestrade gave a short, professional sniff and snapped his notebook shut. "Still, there is an intelligence about this which I do not relish. Send a boy with a wire to Baker Street. If there is a trick in this bag, Mr. Sherlock Holmes will shake it out." Thus it was that, as Westminster clocks tolled the hour of 9 and the fog lifted an inch from the stones, a boy in buttons pelted along the Strand with a yellow paper in his fist, bearing to Num. 221B, the following legend, composed with characteristic economy by Lestrade. "Lady, Imogen Ashdown dead in locked room, all shoes removed from house please. Come at once Lestrade." The house on Belgrave Square, meanwhile, seemed to shrink into itself and listen. In the aviary the finches were still and tight-beaked. The pianoforte, whose right pedal bore its crescent of grit, held its peace. Beyond, in the conservatory's ghostly glass, the dew traced a lattice of tiny diamonds. Somewhere in the back corridor, a pane rattled with the passing of a coal cart, and on the tea-table beside the earthenware bowl, the thin ring of milk about the rim of the abandoned cup acquired a very faint, very delicate, and entirely inexplicable iridescence. The telegram arrived at Baker Street, while the fog pressed the panes like damp felt. Holmes, who had been reconstructing the career of a cigar ash on the fender, glanced at the yellow slip, tapped it once, and passed it to Watson. He had already read in it, with his economical eye, not only Lestrade's appeal but the clerk's flurry and hour. "An economy of words argues, an embarrassment of facts," he said, returning to the ash. "Our energetic friend has bitten a locked room and found it gristly. Read, Watson." Watson read the 4 lines and looked up to find Holmes contemplating a damp oval on the tablecloth where the teapot had stood. "Observe the notch," said Holmes. "Mrs. Hudson set the pot. It was jogged thereafter. The only article in our passage to strike at such a height is a leather case. We shall shortly have a dentist, late for his list." A bell rang. A gentleman with oil of cloves upon him appeared, apologized for missing us, and left a card. Holmes permitted himself the faintest smile. Now shoes. Within 10 minutes they were in a cab for Belgrave Square. Holmes muffled to the jaw and apparently drowsing, though his fingers beat a tattoo. When a barrow went by with newspaper-wrapped bundles of boots, his grey eyes opened and followed it. "Lady Imogen Ashdown," he said at last, "made charity a theatre without frivolity. A vow kept into middle years shows exactitude. Such persons do not die amid carelessness." Lestrade met them in the hall. "You will find, Mr. Holmes, we have done everything by the book, windows fast, key inside the conservatory. No bruise, no cord. The doctor says heart. There are, however, these infernal shoes, which, being absent, make a noise." Holmes returned. In the morning room, he paused, then crossed to the tea-table. His eye took the cup with its milky ring. the earthen bowl and sodden sponge, the single charred match on the grate, and the pianoforte. He knelt and lifted the canted corner of the Turkish rug. "You replaced this, Inspector." "I did," Lestrade owned. It seemed disorderly. It was eloquent, and now must be paraphrased. He let the corner fall, crossed to the opposite edge, where a faint rust halo stained the board, measured it with his penknife, and went to the pedals of the pianoforte. Passing his palm beneath, he brought it away, powdered with fine, pale grit. He rubbed a pinch, then touched it with his tongue. Not street dust, lime, plaster, and a trace of alum. A workshop floor that dresses leather. "Cobbler," said Lestrade. "Then we are in Shoreditch already." The cabman spoke of 2 and 10 for the dozen. "One does not buy boots by the dozen unless one proposes to sort them," said Holmes. "Send for Mr. Copeland of Jude's and Mr. Melrose, the cousin. Also the cabman again. And the charwoman, who did not come? Missing since Tuesday," Lestrade said. "Martha Pike. A boy fetched her wages. Lodges off Saffron Hill." "Send a man. Now, Mrs. Eunice, you made this ready." The maid curtsied, eager and pale. "Her ladyship bathed her feet nightly for the chilblains, sir. Sponge in warm water, milk to stand. She would ring. And last night she did not ring." "No, sir. A woman who keeps a vow rarely breaks a habit on the eve of it," Holmes murmured. "Either she slept earlier, which the physician denies, or another used what was laid." He sniffed again. A dry, sharp odor alum and a breath of turpentine. "Mr. Merrick, the scrap of paper you picked up." The constable produced the tiny blue triangle with a pierced hole and "Monger" in minute print. Holmes held it to the window, smiled without mirth, and returned it. Not fishmonger nor coster. Ironmonger, a workman's tag torn by a string yanked out in haste, put by for the present. "Inspector, your locked room is not locked to a man who walks on silence." Lestrade stared. "On silence, on felt and paste," said Holmes. "That is the ghost of a step. Bring me Mr. Copeland and Mr. Melrose. Let us learn who profited by a house without shoes." Mr. Copeland of Jude's Mission was the first to arrive, thin, angular, his collar threadbare, and his black coat exuding the faint odor of coal smoke and wet wool. He bowed nervously to Holmes, twisting his hat between his fingers, and gave a little cough that seemed habitual. Holmes, who had been examining the charred match on the grate through his lens, looked up with that air of gentle inattentiveness which deceived every suspect he ever questioned. "You called last evening at 9?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Lady Imogen expected me. I came for the usual parcels for the mission, the cast-off garments. Sir, her ladyship had promised a trunkful. And she was quite herself. She was, yes, though fatigued. We spoke of the winter appeal. She seemed troubled that the boot fund had fallen short, and said something curious. She said, 'Perhaps the Lord will take what I will not give.' I thought it no more than her turn of phrase." Holmes inclined his head. "And did she give you the parcels?" "They were ready in the hall, old clothing, but no shoes, naturally. She never touched them. I carried them to the cab and returned the empty trunk. She bade me good night and went to the pianoforte. I heard her playing as I left." "What did she play?" "Something soft and slow, sir. A hymn, I think. The tune was Rock of Ages." Holmes made a note upon his cuff. "You saw no one in the street?" "No one, though the fog was thick enough to hide a regiment." Holmes dismissed him with a nod, and before the echoes of the closing door had died, Mr. Melrose was shown in a handsome man of 40, with a guarded manner and a moustache brushed to aggressive points. He looked about the room with the air of one both grieved and inconvenienced. "I am told you are investigating," he said to Holmes. "It seems a needless indignity. My cousin was delicate. These theatricals of Lestrade's are unworthy." "Death is never theatrical to those who attend it," Holmes returned mildly. You visited her last night also? I did. She wished to discuss the trust for her charities. Her ideas were impracticable. I left about 11. Did she appear agitated? She was excited, almost feverish. She spoke of a revelation, some sign she expected, and laughed oddly. I supposed it the strain of her work among the destitute. You took coffee with her, 1 cup. She poured it herself. Holmes crossed to the tea table and pointed with the stem of his pipe. With milk? Yes, she would have milk with everything, even coffee. It soothed her nerves. Watson, who had been silent, glanced involuntarily at the ring of milk, still circling the cup. Holmes's eyes followed his. An admirable sedative, he murmured, and sometimes a conveyance. You observed nothing peculiar in taste or color. Nothing. You suspect poison, then? I suspect purpose, said Holmes. That is a rarer commodity. When Melrose had gone, Lestrade gave a snort. A cousin who talks of trusts and money, there's your motive. He'll have the inheritance, I suppose. Holmes was already at the pianoforte again. He pressed a key. It gave no sound. He pressed another, and a faint rasp followed, as though grit had lodged beneath the string. You observe, Inspector, he said quietly. That Rock of Ages would have required this. Pedal the one whose crescent of grit lies here. Lady Imogen played it after Mr. Copeland left, and some person or thing left plaster dust upon the floor in that interval. Therefore, she was not alone. But every door was locked, Lestrade objected. Every door was afterward locked, said Holmes. The question is, who turned the key, and why remove every shoe in the house? Not for theft, there is no market for a footman's boots and a cook's slippers together. No, they were taken to obliterate something prints, perhaps, or sounds. As if to confirm the thought, the cabman re-entered, cap in hand, to say he had remembered one further detail. The gentleman who sent me round, sir, he wore odd boots. One heel thick, the other thin. I noticed because he limped a bit. Holmes's head came up sharply. A limp, he repeated. Excellent, my good fellow. That limp may yet walk us to the truth. He turned to Lestrade. A man who walks unevenly leaves an alternating impress, one side heavier, one lighter. On carpet, such marks are imperceptible, but on soft paste they would cut like stamps. I fancy Lady Imogen's sponge water served to prepare such a paste. Lestrade blinked. You mean she laid a trap? Perhaps unwittingly, or perhaps, Inspector, she had divined more of her visitor than she dared confess. At any rate, we must follow the trail where it leads. Send word to the ironmonger's yards along Tottenham Court Road. Ask who delivered plaster or alum dust to a bootmaker this week. Meanwhile, Watson, I think a visit to Saffron Hill will serve us better. A missing charwoman often sweeps away more than dust. And with that, Holmes gathered his coat and hat, the faintest spark in his eyes, as though the fog outside were less to him than the mystery it concealed. We followed him out into the raw November air, where the lamplight swam like ghosts above the pavement, and somewhere, far off, a church clock tolled the sea. 12:45. Saffron Hill lay beneath a perpetual grey, its crooked courts and sagging tenements soaked with a century's grime. As Holmes and I made our way through the narrow lane, the clamour of street hawkers, the clatter of carts, and the reek of refuse blended into one oppressive fog of humanity. Holmes moved among it with the indifference of a man traversing an experiment, his eyes restless, precise, seeking patterns in squalor. We stopped before a small, leaning house whose door was patched with tin and paper, the lodging of the missing charwoman, Martha Pike. A boy idled nearby, chewing at a crust. Holmes showed him a half-crown, and the boy straightened as if electrified. "The woman who lived here?" Holmes asked. "When did she go?" "3 nights, mister, maybe 4. Said she had a job in Belgrave Square. Come back all in a fuss. Then gone again." "Gone where?" The boy shrugged. Don't know, sir. Left a bundle for old Ben the cobbler, though. Down by the arch. Said he was to mend 'em quick. Holmes flicked the coin into the air and strode off before it had landed. We passed beneath the archway the boy had mentioned and found a stall cluttered with broken lasts, scraps of leather, and a small forge that glowed weakly like a dying ember. Behind it sat Ben, a wiry old man whose beard was as grey and thin as the smoke curling from his pipe. Holmes leaned upon the counter. "You have had work from a woman named Martha Pike." The cobbler squinted. "Aye, she brought me a bundle Monday. Women's shoes, children's boots, servants' cast-offs. Said they was to be cleaned and mended for the mission. Did you mend them?" "I did not. When I opened the parcel, I found half of 'em weren't to be mended at all. Cut through the soles, they was, like someone had been scraping summit off 'em." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Scraping?" "Aye, the undersides, neat as you please. Like she'd walked through something and wanted it gone. I burnt the worst of 'em, reeked something fierce, they did." Holmes drew a breath through his nose, the keen excitement of discovery stirring in him. "Did you notice a smell?" "Sharp, sir. Like a chemist's bench lime or acid, maybe. I've had tanners bring hides that smelt the same." "Lime and alum," Holmes muttered, half to himself. "Watson, Our Lady's vow of charity has left a chemical fingerprint. She walked barefoot through death." The cobbler looked up sharply, but Holmes was already at the door. We followed him into the street where the mist rolled low and yellow against the lamplight. "It fits, Watson," he said, hailing a cab. "Every detail converges: lime dust on the pianoforte, alum in the air, plaster on the soles. Lady Imogen's visitor came from a workshop or manufactory where such substances are used. A tanner's, a cobbler's yard, or, more specifically, a place where leather is treated. The removal of the shoes was to conceal the traces of that dust upon the floors, and the sponge water, prepared nightly for her feet, became the very substance by which her visitor's crime was recorded." "But what crime, Holmes?" I demanded. "We still have no evidence of murder." Holmes smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the passing streets. "We have evidence of purpose, my dear Watson, and purpose rarely travels unaccompanied by guilt. A heart does not stop of its own accord at the very moment a houseful of shoes walks away. There is something yet that binds it together, something beneath the surface, as hidden as the dust under her piano pedal." Our cab rattled into Holborn, where Holmes called for the driver to stop outside a chemist's shop. Inside, he purchased a small vial of reagent and a sheet of litmus paper, which he stowed in his coat pocket. "A trifling test," he said. "It will answer a question or two when we return." "Return to Belgrave Square?" "Indeed. I must examine that cup again, and more particularly the milk within it. Our Mr. Melrose spoke truly when he said she took milk to calm her nerves, but perhaps someone knew how to still them forever." The fog thickened again as we approached the square, the lamps hanging like weary eyes above the road. Lestrade awaited us in the hall, his expression a mixture of impatience and reluctant respect. "You've been to Saffron Hill, I hear," he said. "Found the charwoman?" "Not the woman," Holmes replied, removing his gloves, "but what she took from here, and why she never returned." The cup still stood there, ringed with its strange milk stain. He dipped a glass rod into the residue, touched it to the litmus, and watched as the paper flared scarlet. "As I suspected," he said softly. "Acidic, too much so for milk alone. There was something mingled with it. Something corrosive in minute degree. A trace of oxalic acid, perhaps, which in sufficient quantity is fatal. She drank it, felt faint, and died before the match she struck could light her fire." Lestrade whistled low. "Poison, then, and the cousin?" Holmes shook his head. "No, he is a fool, not a murderer. The man with the limp, the workman who sent the cab, who spoke of 2 and 10 for the dozen that is our author. He moved unseen, perhaps through the conservatory, his passage silenced by felt, and took the shoes to bury the proof of his presence. He knew the dust on his boots would betray him. And yet, why Lady Imogen? Why her vow? He turned to the window, the fog framing his silhouette in pale silver. There lies our next answer, Watson. We must find a workshop where a man limps and speaks of dozens. There we shall find both motive and method. And as the church bells struck the hour, Holmes's eyes caught that distant spark, which always meant the chase had truly begun. The next morning broke with a brittle chill that seemed to tighten every sound in the air. Frost glistened along the railings of Baker Street as I found Holmes already at the window, his lean frame silhouetted against a pewter sky. The remains of an early breakfast lay untouched beside him, though his pipe sent up a steady, contemplative smoke. "You have been awake all night," I said, noting the untouched coffee. "Sleep, my dear Watson, is the enemy of logic when the mind is occupied with clearer company," he replied. "I have been reconstructing our limping visitor's route from Belgrave Square. Every clue suggests a man accustomed to the lower quarters, a craftsman or laborer, and yet he was at ease in a house of gentry. There lies the riddle." He turned from the window with that quick, decisive movement that always preceded action. "Lestrade will have reports from the ironmongers by now. If he has not, we shall compel them ourselves." Within the hour, we were rattling toward Tottenham Court Road. The fog of the previous day had lifted, leaving the streets washed clean but colorless. Holmes directed the cabman to stop before a narrow shop, whose window displayed tacks, rivets, and a dozen brass tools glinting in orderly rows. Inside, a short, bald man in a leather apron looked up from weighing a coil of wire. "We are inquiring," Holmes began smoothly, "about recent purchases, plaster of Paris. Alum, lime, or any mixture thereof, perhaps delivered to a bootmaker or cobbler's establishment within the week." The man adjusted his spectacles. "Aye, I've had such an order. A barrel of plaster, 2 sacks of alum, and 1 of lime, all sent Tuesday evening to a Mr. Silas Grange, Crown Lane, near Giles." Holmes's expression scarcely changed, but I caught the slight gleam in his eyes. "A cobbler? Bootmaker," the man corrected, "and one of the cleverest. Ex-military, though limps from an old wound, I hear." Holmes's gaze met mine in silent confirmation. "The very man," he murmured. "Watson, I think our limping tradesman has walked directly into his own snare. We found the premises easily enough, a low building wedged between a pawnbroker's and a rag dealer's, its narrow sign bearing in fading letters S, Grange, Boot and Leather Goods. The windows were filmed with dust, but from within came the rhythmic tap of a hammer and the faint, unmistakable scent of tanned hide and turpentine. Holmes motioned for silence and entered. The man behind the bench looked up. He was of middle height, thick in the shoulders, his left leg drawn stiffly as he stood. His beard was shot through with grey, and his hands were roughened to a craftsman's polish. "Mr. Silas Grange?" Holmes said lightly. "That's me. Repairs or fittings?" "Neither," Holmes replied. "We are from Scotland Yard." Grange's eyes flicked once to the doorway, measuring the distance, but Holmes's calm voice held him. "There is no need for alarm. We merely inquire about your work for Lady Imogen Ashdown of Belgrave Square." At the name, something subtle shifted in the man's face. His hands stilled upon the bench, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the lamp. "I don't know the lady," he said at last. Holmes examined a row of boots upon the shelf, turning one over casually. "Curious," he said. "This pair bears her crest, see, the Ashdown lion pressed faintly on the heel. An order for the servants, perhaps? Or a charitable donation? It matters little, for we have already found the same plaster dust upon her pianoforte as upon your floor." Grange's jaw worked. "You've no right." "I have every right to inquire," Holmes interrupted softly. "A cabman remembers a limping gentleman sending him to that very house. A servant has vanished, and her mistress lies dead. You will see, Mr. Grange, that your silence serves you ill." The man's eyes darted toward the small furnace behind him, glowing faintly with coals. He made a half-step in its direction, but Holmes was quicker. In a blur, he was beside him, one hand gripping the man's wrist. "You will not burn what might hang you," he said. With a hiss of defiance, Grange wrenched free and slumped back against the wall. "She sent for me," he said hoarsely. "I'd done work for her before the mission shoes. She said she wanted a dozen pairs mended for the poor. When I came that night, she was waiting. She asked questions, too many questions about where I got my leather, about the women I hired. She knew about Martha Pike." "Martha Pike worked for you," Holmes said quietly. "For years. She knew every trade I ran. I never meant to harm the lady, but she threatened to go to the police, said I was using mission money for my own gain. I lost my temper. She took the cup herself, I swear it, said I'd sooner drink poison than shame. Then she went still. God, forgive me, I panicked. I took the shoes, all of them, to hide the marks I'd left." Holmes regarded him in silence for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "And Martha Pike?" The man's voice dropped to a rasp. "Gone. She took her share and fled before the fog lifted." Holmes released him, his expression one of cold contempt. "A confession of cowardice, if not of murder. You are fortunate, Mr. Grange, that science is patient where justice is not." The acid in that milk did not pour itself. As Lestrade's men arrived to take the bootmaker into custody, Holmes lingered at the doorway, watching the fog curl past the guttering lamps. "It is never the weapon, Watson," he said softly. "It is the hand that hides in plain sight. This hand stitched Charity from deceit and unraveled it by a single step." And though Grange was led away, I could not help but feel, as Holmes's eyes followed the mist beyond Crown Lane, that the case had not yet closed. There was still one thread left, loose the woman who had vanished into the fog, carrying with her the final secret of Lady Imogen's last night. As the clatter of the departing constables faded, Holmes stood immobile, the brim of his hat drawn low, his eyes fixed upon the dull red glow of the furnace, where Grange's unfinished work smouldered. The bootmaker's confession, though outwardly complete, had not satisfied him. I could see it in the faint tightening of his jaw and the absent rhythm of his fingers upon the windowsill. There was, as ever, some portion of the truth which had not yet surfaced. "Watson," he said quietly, "there are lies which serve as mortar for a greater deceit. Grange's story holds too few details where guilt should overflow, and too many where a simple omission would suffice. The woman, Martha Pike, she is the hinge upon which this case turns. Until we find her, we possess only the skeleton of the crime, not its living form." I followed him into the fog of Crown Lane, where the air smelled of soot and tannin. He hailed a cab, and as we drove northward, I ventured, "Do you doubt the confession, then?" He admitted his guilt plainly enough. "My dear fellow," Holmes said, turning to me with a faint, ironic smile, "there is nothing plain about it. A man who lies will often offer one truth as payment for two deceits. Grange spoke the truth of his trade, yes, but he lied about the manner of Lady Imogen's death. Poison was not chance, it was preparation, and he did not act alone." The cab rattled to a stop before the narrow entrance of a public lodging-house in Clerkenwell, where Holmes had reasoned Martha Pike might have sought shelter. He motioned me to follow, and we climbed the narrow stair, each board groaning as if resenting our intrusion. At the end of the corridor, behind a half-open door, came the sound of shallow breathing and a low murmur, as of someone speaking in feverish sleep. Holmes knocked once. There was no reply. He entered softly. The room was dark, the only light a candle guttering in a glass near the bed. Upon that bed lay a woman, gaunt, unkempt, her hands clutching a threadbare blanket. One look sufficed. It was Martha Pike. Holmes bent over her, his expression unreadable. "Martha," he said gently, "you know who I am. You have heard my name. The police will come soon, but if you speak now, you may yet do Lady Imogen justice." Her eyes opened dull, watery, with that peculiar light of guilt that seeks confession more for relief than redemption. "I never meant harm," she whispered. "She was good to me, so good. But he said it was only a scare, that it would make her sign the papers." Holmes's voice was calm but urgent. "What papers?" "The deed for the mission fund," she gasped. "Lady Imogen kept it by her desk. Mr. Melrose wanted it back, said she'd no right to tie the money to the poorhouses. He brought Grange to frighten her, only frighten, he said. But she drank the milk herself. She thought it would cure her chill." "Melrose!" I exclaimed. "Good heavens!" Holmes then, the cousin. "Quietly, Watson," he murmured, placing a hand upon my arm. His gaze never left the woman's face. "And afterward, Martha?" I panicked. She fell before my eyes. "He said to burn the shoes, to take them away. I ran to Grange's with them. He took his share and said I'd done enough. I couldn't sleep after. I thought the fog would hide me, but it followed me here. It always does." Her voice faltered. Holmes examined her briefly, then straightened. "She is dying," he said. "The air here has done its worst, and her conscience the rest." He turned to me. "Fetch the constable below. I shall have her statement written and signed before she departs this world." When I returned, Holmes had already scrawled upon his notebook the vital details. Martha's trembling signature lay beneath his precise script. Her breath came thin and fast, her last words no more than a thread. He said she'd never miss what she gave away, but she did. She did. Her hand fell still. Holmes closed her eyes and stood for a long moment in silence. "There is your final proof," he said at last. "Grange was a tool." Melrose struck the blow with another's hand. Outside, the frost had thickened into a fine snow that muffled the city's din. As we returned to the cab, Holmes drew his coat close. He believed himself safe behind another's guilt. "He will find that I am less merciful than the gallows, for I shall leave him no refuge in uncertainty. Come." Watson Belgrave Square awaits its reckoning. The horses trotted through the whitening streets, their hooves muffled by the snow. In the faint reflection of the window, I saw the look on Holmes's face, grim, calculating, but not yet satisfied. "The web is complete," he murmured. "Now we must wait for the spider to stir." The snow was falling in earnest by the time we reached Belgrave Square. Again, soft flakes settling upon the railings and the black hats of the constables posted at the gate. The house, dimly lit and still draped in mourning, stood as it had that dreadful morning, though the air about it felt altered less the scene of a mystery than the hushed waiting room of justice. Holmes ascended the steps without pause, his long coat brushing the drifted whiteness aside. Lestrade met us at the door, his face drawn with fatigue and a touch of irritation. "You've been scarce these 12 hours, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I was beginning to think you'd washed your hands of the business. The bootmaker's in custody, the maid's found dead, and the press is already talking of a philanthropic tragedy. Seems to me we've wrung this one dry." "On the contrary," Holmes replied evenly, removing his gloves. "We have only just reached the marrow. Grange's confession is a fabrication, stitched together like his own wares. He did not poison Lady Imogen. He was sent to silence the noise her conscience had begun to make, and the hand that sent him stands far closer to this hearth than your cells in Bow Street." Lestrade blinked, his brows knitting. "You don't mean?" "I mean Mr. Melrose," Holmes said quietly. "He who spoke of impracticable trusts, who had most to gain from the dissolution of her estates. You will observe, Inspector, that the pattern holds. Lady Imogen's vow made her a curiosity. Her fortune made her a target. Her cousin desired both freedom from her eccentric charities and control over her wealth. Poison, delivered by proxy, was his simplest recourse." Lestrade whistled, then frowned. "That's a grave charge, Mr. Holmes. and one not easily proven. You've no witness living Martha Pike's dead, by your own telegram." Holmes's expression hardened. "Dying. Inspector, not dead." And before she passed, she confessed, "Her signature lies in my pocket." He drew forth the folded paper, marked by his own precise hand and the faint, wavering scrawl of Martha Pike. Lestrade took it, his eyes scanning rapidly. "This name's Melrose," he muttered. "And Grange, too." "Precisely," Holmes said. "But before you act upon it, allow me a small experiment. If you are to arrest an aristocrat, you must do so beyond the reach of denial. Words, however damning, are air. Demonstration is iron. I propose, therefore, that we invite Mr. Melrose back to this house. You will remain unseen but within earshot. There are certain questions which, when asked under the proper pressure, have a way of answering themselves." An hour later, Mr. Melrose arrived. The footman who admitted him looked uneasy. Perhaps the air of accusation already clung to his master's coat. He entered the morning room where Lady Imogen had died, and finding Holmes alone beside the pianoforte, started visibly. "Mr. Holmes," he said, with forced politeness, "I had not expected this at so late an hour." "It grows late indeed," Holmes returned. "The night when truth is weighed against guilt is always late in coming. You have my thanks for your promptness. Sit down, if you please." Melrose hesitated, then obeyed. The room was as it had been, the extinguished fire, the tea-table untouched, the faint odor of milk still in the air. Holmes gestured toward it. "You recognize this cup, no doubt. The last Lady Imogen ever touched. I have had its residue tested, oxalic acid, in a concentration so subtle that only the most delicate chemistry could have detected it." Melrose's face tightened, though he strove for composure. "Are you implying, sir, that I—" "Implying nothing," Holmes said smoothly, "only observing that it was you who provided her with the milk that evening. Your servant brought it from your own house at 10:30. Your cousin trusted you implicitly, as benefactor and heir alike." A flush rose on Melrose's cheeks. "This— preposterous." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his tone still calm. "And yet the facts are relentless. Grange has confessed his part. The charwoman, before her death, confirmed that the deed for Lady Imogen's charities passed briefly into your hands that night. You destroyed it, did you not? And substituted another one which restored control of the Ashdown fortune to yourself." The silence that followed was as taut as wire. Then Melrose's lips moved, though no sound emerged. His eyes darted to the door, where Lestrade stepped forward from the shadows. The inspector's voice was grim. "I should advise you to speak, sir. It will go easier in the end." For a moment, Melrose appeared to waver between defiance and collapse. Then, with a trembling breath, he rose. "I did not mean her to die," he said hoarsely. "It was to frighten her, nothing more. She would not listen, she said. She would leave everything to the destitute, as if blood counted for nothing. Me, a few drops would bring her to her senses, make her ill, not dead. When she fell, when I saw her eyes, I knew." Holmes watched him silently, his gaze almost sorrowful. "You have at least spared the gallows the trouble of discovery," he said. Lestrade stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in the lamplight. "Arthur Melrose, I arrest you on the charge of murder." As the heavy door closed behind them, the house seemed to exhale. Holmes stood for a long while, looking down at the faint iridescent ring on the cup. "So ends the charity that began with bare feet," he murmured, "and so begins the justice that must walk without shoes of mercy." Outside, the snow fell silently upon the city, blanketing every street in white, as though London itself sought to hide the prints of its own sins. It was past midnight when we left Belgrave Square, the carriage wheels whispering through the fresh fallen snow. Holmes had not spoken since Melrose's arrest. His eyes, fixed upon the white blur beyond the window, reflected neither satisfaction nor triumph. I had long since learned that his silences were not born of fatigue, but of thought in its most refined and dangerous form. At last, as the gas lamps of Piccadilly flickered past, he stirred. "You perceive, Watson, that while the visible knots of this affair are untied, one strand remains unaccounted for, the strand that binds motive to design. Men do not kill from greed alone. They kill from fear." "Fear," I repeated. But of what could Melrose, a man of means and security, be afraid? "Of discovery," Holmes replied softly. "Not of his cousin's testamentary obstinacy, but of what lay beneath her charities." Lady Imogen Ashdown was more than an eccentric philanthropist. She had stumbled, perhaps unwittingly, upon the machinery that fed her own benevolence. The very workshops that clothed her poor were supplied by Melrose's illicit enterprises. It was her kindness that exposed his corruption. I stared at him in astonishment. "You mean to say he profited from her missions?" "Precisely. The mission garments were sewn in his own sweatshops, under contracts disguised through intermediaries. Lady Imogen had begun to suspect that her name was being used to lend virtue to vice. Her vow of poverty made her incorruptible, but it also made her dangerous to those who were not. Melrose saw exposure, ruin, and imprisonment before him, and so he silenced the only voice that could speak with authority. The cab lurched to a halt before Baker Street. Holmes descended briskly, his cloak sweeping behind him like the shadow of some great bird. Inside, he lit the fire and paced before it, his thin fingers steepled beneath his chin. The lines of fatigue upon his face were deepened by the flickering light, but his eyes shone with that peculiar brilliance that always accompanied the final revelation. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "the pattern of the shoes was no trivial curiosity. They were the currency of charity, the token by which the guilty sought to cloak their gain in the garments of virtue. When the shoes vanished, the pretense did too. Melrose believed that by removing them, he erased the trace of his fraud. Yet the one woman who wore none was the only one who saw the truth." He stopped before the window, watching the snow gather on the sill. "There is a strange poetry in it, don't you think? The woman who owned no shoes was the only soul in London to walk uncorrupted." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The ticking of the clock and the crackle of the hearth seemed to fill the silence with the echoes of that haunted house. I thought of Lady Imogen, serene in her faith, poisoned by those she sought to save, and of Holmes standing now like some austere sentinel of justice, his victory more solemn than sweet. "What will become of Melrose?" I asked quietly. "Justice will tread where charity faltered," Holmes said. "Lestrade will see to that. But I fear the true rot runs deeper. London is a city where virtue and vice share the same boots. One cannot move without soiling the other. Lady Imogen's vow was absurd to the world, but in its absurdity lay the only purity left to her." He turned away from the window then, his voice softening. "Come, Watson, you must write this one carefully. The public will speak of eccentricity and inheritance, but let them, if they can, see also the tragedy of goodness in a corrupt age. I am tired tonight, tired of the cleverness of evil." He drew his dressing gown about him and sank into his armchair, his profile etched against the glow of the fire. The snow thickened outside, falling in heavy, muffling flakes that swallowed the city's restless noise. I watched him for a long while, that lonely figure whose mind could unravel any tangle yet could find no rest in the peace it restored. And as the flames dwindled to embers, Holmes murmured almost to himself, "There are footsteps, Watson, that leave no print upon the snow, but I hear them all the same." The following morning was pale and still. The snow hardened into thin, glassy sheets that crackled beneath the passing wheels. Holmes was already dressed when I descended, seated before a breakfast left untouched, save for the coffee cooling in its cup. The newspaper lay open beside him, and I saw, as he turned it toward me, the headline that crowned the column: aristocrat charged in lady's death motive of greed and scandal. They are quick to conclude, Holmes remarked, and yet the truth, like a shadow, lingers half a step behind the light. The case, you see, is closed to the law but not to logic. I stared at him in mild disbelief. Surely you cannot doubt it now, Holmes. Melrose's own confession, your evidence, the maid's dying words, what remains? Doubt, my dear Watson, is the spur that keeps reason alive, he replied. Melrose confessed, because guilt compelled him, not because the facts demanded it. He believed himself cornered, and so filled in the gaps of a story he did not wholly comprehend. There was something in his eyes last night, terror, yes, but not of exposure. It was fear of something, or someone, greater still. I was about to speak when Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a sealed envelope. Delivered by hand, Mr. Holmes. The messenger said it was urgent. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. Sir, if you value the truth in the matter of Lady Ashdown, come alone to the lime wharf on the river before the tide turns. Bring no police. The living are not all innocent, and the dead are not all silent. It was unsigned. Another trap? I asked. Undoubtedly, said Holmes, his eyes gleaming with renewed vitality. But a trap can be most instructive, provided one knows when to step inside. An hour later, we were making our way through the freezing mists that hung over the Thames. The river lay, dull and oily, the barges frozen against their moorings. At the far end of a narrow pier, half sunk in the fog, stood a low warehouse with broken shutters and the name Lime Wharf Trading Company painted in fading letters across its lintel. Holmes moved forward noiselessly, motioning for me to remain behind. I waited near the corner post, my breath hanging before me like smoke, when I saw a figure detach itself from the deeper gloom and approach Holmes. It was a woman, slight, cloaked, her steps unsteady. Her face, when the mist lifted briefly, was drawn and pale, yet not unfamiliar. Martha Pike, I whispered, astonished. Impossible, she was dead. Her voice, faint but distinct, carried across the wharf. I did not die, Mr. Holmes. You wrote the world's tale too soon. I could not stay to face the law, not until I had set right what was left undone. Holmes bowed slightly. Then speak quickly, madam. The tide turns fast, and so, I fear, does fate. She pressed something into his hand, a folded parchment, yellowed and creased. This is the deed she signed, the true one. He thought it burned, but I hid it. Melrose's greed made me his accomplice, but not his creature. I ran because I feared what would come next. The workshop, the missions, they were not his alone. There was another behind him. Who? Holmes asked sharply. The man who lent him money, the one who bought the silence of the mission trustees. I saw him once, grey hair, scar on his temple. They called him the broker. Her words broke off as a sound echoed through the fog, a footstep, quick and deliberate. Holmes turned, but before he could move, the crack of a pistol split the air. Martha staggered, one hand to her breast. Holmes caught her as she fell. A shadow moved at the edge of the wharf and vanished into the river mist. I fired my revolver once, but the bullet met only emptiness. When the fog settled, Holmes was kneeling beside her, his face pale as the snow on the planks. She clutched at his sleeve, her voice barely a breath. The broker, not gone, still watching. Her hand slipped away. Holmes rose slowly, the parchment clutched tight in his hand. Watson, he said, his tone low but steady. It seems our case has grown another life and taken one more. The river whispered beneath us, carrying away the echo of the shot, and in that sound I felt the strange, inexorable pull of fate. The lady who owned no shoes was not yet done walking. Holmes stood motionless beside Martha's body, the parchment she had delivered trembling slightly between his fingers. The fog wrapped around us like a shroud, the faint echo of the shot still rolling across the river. I had seen my friend in moments of triumph and defeat, but never before had I seen such composure in the very face of shock. His eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, scanned the darkness where the shadow had fled, then turned to the slumped form at his feet. "Quickly, Watson," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "There is no saving her, but we may yet save what she died for." I bent beside him, feeling the faint warmth still lingering in her hand. He drew from her pocket a small key on a string of twine, its surface worn smooth by years of use. He examined it briefly, then slipped it into his waistcoat. "The broker," he murmured. "The grey-haired man with the scar, this shadow moves behind all the others. Melrose was his puppet, and Lady Imogen's charities his stage." A sound from the water caught our attention, the hollow scrape of oars vanishing into the fog. Holmes darted to the edge of the wharf, peering into the void. "Gone," he said softly, "but not beyond my reach." We summoned the constable from the quay, leaving instructions for Martha's body to be taken to the station, and returned at once to Baker Street. There, beneath the lamplight, Holmes unfolded the parchment she had given him. It was the original deed, the true one. The ink, though faded, was unmistakably Lady Imogen's hand. The terms assigned her entire fortune, not merely to the poor, but to a specific institution, the Bartholomew Fund for Industrial Reform. Below, in a second, rougher hand, was a name written in pencil, Charles D. Prentice, and beneath it, a date 2 days before her death. "Prentice," he said at last, "the broker's true name, I'll wager. A financier with a taste for speculation. Watson, fetch the directory." I did so, and he ran a finger swiftly down the column. "Here, Prentice, Company, Lombard Street. Dealers in foreign securities, and, if my memory serves, recently censured in the press for dubious transactions with colonial suppliers." He rose, his decision made. If Melrose was the blade, this man is the hand that wielded it, and it is the hand we must now grasp. The following morning found us at the offices of Prentice & Co., a tall, grey building with shuttered windows and a brass plate polished to a lawyer's shine. Inside, clerks moved noiselessly under the watchful eyes of ledgers. Holmes gave his name and requested to see Mr. Prentice on a matter of private urgency. We were shown into a small office panelled in oak, where a man of 60 sat behind a heavy desk. His hair was steel grey, his right temple marred by a thin white scar. Holmes bowed slightly. "Mr. Prentice, I believe?" The man's cold gaze flicked over us. "You have the advantage, sir." "Sherlock Holmes," my friend said. "You will forgive the intrusion. But I believe you knew Lady Imogen Ashdown." A pause. "Then, I conducted certain charitable transactions on her behalf." "Indeed, and also on your own." Holmes drew the parchment from his pocket and laid it upon the desk. "This deed was recovered last night. You will observe your name appended in pencil, a habit common among men who prefer discretion to legality. Lady Imogen signed this under the impression that her funds would serve the poor. In truth, they served your factories and your ledgers. When she discovered the fraud, you employed Melrose to silence her." Prentice's hand twitched toward the drawer, but Holmes's revolver was already leveled. "No, sir, that would be unwise." The man sagged back in his chair, the color draining from his face. "You can prove nothing." Holmes smiled thinly. "I can prove enough. The handwriting, the witness, the shot fired on the wharf. Martha Pike's death will speak more eloquently than any testimony." For the first time, Prentice's composure cracked. "She was weak," he muttered. "A servant, she would have ruined us all." "Yet she did," Holmes said quietly. "You see, Mr. Prentice, truth has a peculiar persistence. It walks barefoot, but it leaves deeper prints than deceit ever can." When we left Lombard Street an hour later, the constables were already at the door. Holmes walked in silence for a time, his breath clouding the winter air. "It is done, Watson," he said at last. "The lady who owned no shoes has walked her final mile, and in her passing, She left London cleaner by 2 souls. He paused, his gaze distant. But I wonder, my friend, whether she would have thanked us. For her, mercy was law. For me, law must suffice where mercy cannot. We reached Baker Street as the bells struck noon. The snow was thawing now, the streets wet and dark again. Holmes stood a moment at the window, watching the boots of passers-by splash through the slush, each leaving its fleeting mark. Strange, he murmured. How the truest path is always the one no one sees. And with that, he turned from the window, took up his violin, and played a single, mournful phrase that lingered in the air, like the memory of footsteps fading into silence. The trial that followed was as swift as London memory is short. Newspapers printed each day's revelations with the fervor of a city that loves scandal more than truth. Melrose, pale and trembling, turned Queen's evidence in the hope of leniency, and his testimony sealed Prentice's fate. The broker, calm even in the dock, denied nothing. He spoke, instead, of commerce and necessity, of a world where virtue was too costly to trade. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, he bowed his head without protest. I attended each session beside Holmes, watching the public's curiosity rise and fall like a tide, and felt a strange melancholy at the quiet dignity with which evil sometimes accepts its own exposure. When it was done, London turned its attention elsewhere. A new scandal occupied Fleet Street by the following week, and Lady Imogen's name was left to the footnotes of philanthropy. But Holmes was not one to let a case fade without study. In the weeks that followed, I found him most evenings by the fire, not idle but inwardly restless, his violin lying silent beside him. One night, as the frost silvered the windowpanes once more, he broke a long silence. "Do you recall, Watson," he said, "the first words Lestrade sent us all shoes removed from the house? A simple phrase, yet one that contained the essence of the whole. The shoes were not only concealment, they were symbol. Every deceit in this affair was a kind of footwear, each man striving to cover the tracks of his conscience." I smiled faintly. "You speak as if philosophy were a branch of detection." "It is," he replied gravely. "Without understanding motive, one can never truly close a case. Lady Imogen lived by conviction alone, and in that she was stronger than any of them. Her vow stripped her of comfort, but clothed her in something rarer clarity. It is an uncomfortable quality, Watson. It exposes the nakedness of all around it." He rose and began to pace, the old energy returning to his movements. Observe how each player in this grim little drama mirrored the other. Melrose coveted wealth but feared exposure. Prentice commanded power but craved legitimacy. Even poor Martha Pike, driven by hunger and guilt, sought redemption through secrecy. Only the lady who owned no shoes walked without disguise. That, I think, was what frightened them most. His words lingered with me long after. I had often marveled at Holmes's intellect, but never more so than in moments when he allowed a glimpse of the humanity beneath it, rare, fleeting, but undeniably there. A fortnight later, a small parcel arrived at Baker Street, wrapped in plain brown paper. It bore no signature, only a note in a delicate feminine hand. "For the man who sees what others overlook." Inside lay a pair of women's shoes, simple, unadorned, the leather scarcely worn. Holmes examined them in silence, then set them upon the mantel beside his magnifying glass. "The Mission Trustees, perhaps," he said lightly. "A sentimental gesture." But that night, as I was preparing to leave, saw him standing before the shoes with an expression I had never seen before. Something between reverence and regret. He reached out, traced one gloved finger along the worn strap, and said softly, "There walks a soul London will not remember, yet whose tread has altered its path." We did not speak of the case again, though from time to time I would find him gazing into the fire with that faraway look which spoke of unfinished puzzles. Life at Baker Street resumed its rhythm of quiet mornings and sudden calls to adventure. Yet whenever a new client crossed the threshold, I could see in Holmes's eyes a brief flicker of memory of fog and music and a woman who had walked barefoot into eternity. And so ended the case of the lady who owned no shoes. I record it now not merely as one of Holmes's most delicate triumphs, but as one that revealed something more enduring than any deduction: the strange kinship between reason and compassion. For though Holmes professed indifference to sentiment, I believe that in this case, beneath the keen blade of his logic, there beat a faint but steady pulse of sorrow for a goodness too pure to live and a world too flawed to see it.